The Imperial Council Part 2. Ottoman tradition dates the creation of the post of military judge to the reign of Murad I, and since, from the early days of the empire, the Sultan must have needed a legal advisor on his council, this tradition is quite possibly correct. There was, it seems, only one military judge on the council until the last years of Mehmed II. The creation of a second was, according to the 16th century biographer Topkapi, the work of the Grand Vizier, Mehmed Pasha of Karaman. At the time, Topkapi tells us, the sole military judge was Molla Castellani, and Mehmed Pasha, fearing the effect on the Sultan of his outspoken love of the truth and seeing the need to counteract his influence, proposed that henceforth there should be two. It was Mehmed Pasha who appointed Castellani as military judge of Rumelia, while he promoted the judge of Istanbul to become military judge of Anatolia. From that time onwards, these two office holders became regular members of the Imperial Council. In the early 17th century, Topkapi's continuator reported that, after his conquest of Syria and Egypt, Selim I, 1512-20, created a third military judge to represent the legal affairs of these provinces. However, the enmity between the appointee and the Grand Vizier, Piri Pasha, soon led to the abolition of the post. Henceforth, there were usually two military judges, although in 1545, the Italian, Luigi Bassano, reported 3. The number of treasurers on the Imperial Council also increased over the years. In the 15th century, there was perhaps one. By 1526, there were two. These, it seems, were responsible for the imperial estates and revenues in, respectively, Rumelia and Anatolia. By 1539, there were three treasurers and, from 1587, 4, overseeing the revenues of Rumelia, Anatolia, Istanbul and the Danube, that is, the west and north coast of the Black Sea. These were the treasurers on the Imperial Council. There were others in the provinces, notably at Aleppo, a post which dates probably from the conquest of Syria in 1516. The increase in numbers clearly reflects the growing importance of the treasury, especially from the end of the 16th century. This was a time when inflation and increasingly expensive but unprofitable wars led to shortfalls in revenue and the occasional inability to pay the troops. In 1572, the government debased the silver aksh. Another debasement of 50% in 1584 led to Janissary riots. Further debasements and late payment followed in 1589, 1593, and 1606. There were further crises as the 17th century advanced. In these circumstances, raising cash became a primary duty of the council, bringing with it a rise in the numbers and status of the treasurers. 12. The post of chancellor must date from the earliest days of the empire. Ottoman documents from the 14th century are extremely rare, but the few which survive suggest that the sultans already possessed a chancellery. In fact, the earliest surviving sultanic cipher, which it was, nominally at least, the chancellor's function to draw, 13 appears on Orhan's trust deed of 1324.14. The office may, therefore, date back to this time. There seems, however, never to have been more than one chancellor in the council, despite the growing number of clerks in his department, as council business increased during the 16th and 17th centuries. Until the early 16th century, there may also have been, unless the reference is simply to the treasurer, another member of the council, the assayer. Since Spandow's talks of an office which is concerned with the weight of money, which also occupies a seat in the council of pashas and appas. The reference, however, seems to be unique. The members of the Imperial Council, viziers, military judges, treasurers and chancellor, represented the different branches of the Sultan's government and, from the 16th century, their posts became, more or less, mutually exclusive. Military judges or chancellors, for example, did not as a rule become viziers. Each position tended to represent the pinnacle of a specialized career, whether as governor or military commander in the case of viziers, in the learned and legal professions in the case of military judges, in the financial service in the case of treasurers, or in the scribal service in the case of chancellors. This, however, had not always been the case. There seems to have been a greater fluidity in the functions of council members before the end of the 15th century. Chandarli Ibrahim, for example, became vizier in 1420, after serving since 1415 as a military judge. Mehmed Pasha of Karaman came to the Grand Vizierate in 1476, after occupying the chancellorship for 12 years. Such functional changes seem to have become rarer in the 16th century. There was also change, from the mid-15th century, in the backgrounds of members of the council, at least of the viziers. What is most striking about the century before the conquest of Constantinople is the hereditary right to the vizierate of a single family. 15 The first of these was Chandarli Hayreddin Pasha who, according to Ottoman tradition, began his career as a judge in Bilecik, Iznik, and Bursa. The same tradition makes Murad I appoint him as military judge and finally, in 1380, as vizier. In this position, he acted both as governor and military commander, roles which the viziers were to preserve. He died at Saray in 1387. His son, Chandarli Ali, succeeded him as vizier to Murad I, Bayezid I and Bayezid's son Suleiman. Rumelia, 1402-11, on whose behalf he was one of the negotiators of the Gallipoli Treaty of 1403. He died in 1406. In this year, his brother, Ibrahim, was judge in Bursa. By 1415, Mehmed I had appointed him military judge. In 1420, he became second vizier to Bayezid Pasha, and, after the latter's death at the hands of Murad II's uncle, Mustafa, succeeded him as first vizier. He died in 1429. The Chandarli line of viziers continued with Ibrahim's eldest son, Halil, who was first vizier by 1443. By 1447, Chandarli Halil's son, Suleiman, who predeceased his father, was military judge. Halil's downfall came with the accession of Mehmed II. The Sultan evidently disliked him, as he was responsible for deposing him from the throne in 1446, and reinstating his father after the latter's abdication. 16 More importantly, however, Halil had opposed the siege of Constantinople in 1453 and indeed, according to the report of Leonard of Chios who was in the besieged city, actually collaborated with the defenders. Not long afterwards, the Sultan had Chandarli Halil executed. This was not, however, quite the end of the Chandarli era. In 1453, Chandarli Halil's son, Ibrahim, was judge in Edirne. In 1465, Mehmed II appointed him military judge and, 8 years later, tutor to his son, Bayezid and Amasya. On his accession to the throne in 1481, Bayezid brought with him his own entourage from Amasya to the capital, appointing Chandarli Halil military judge of Rumelia. In 1486, he became a vizier and finally, in 1498, grand vizier. 2 years later, he died in the campaign against Napaktos, Lepanto. Ibrahim was the last of the Chandarlis to occupy the vizierate. Mehmed II's execution of Chandarli Halil was clearly an act of personal pique rather than of policy. Nonetheless, it represents a moment of change in the institution of the vizierate. Before 1453, most, although not all, of the viziers seem to have been freeborn men of Muslim and Turkish descent. After 1453, Turkish Muslim viziers were the exception. Instead, the sultans came to rely on men who had grown up in the royal household, rather than on men from Muslim households that enjoyed independent power and influence. In the provinces, members of the great Muslim families, especially those of the Rumelian marcher lords, continued to flourish and to receive office from the sultan, but as provincial governors rather than as viziers in the capital. Nonetheless, the vizierial appointments of Mehmed II and Bayezid II indicate that these sultans were still careful to harness local dynastic interests to Ottoman service. A number of the viziers whom they appointed were not raised from the dust as was, typically, to become the case in the 16th century, but were rather the scions of former Christian dynasties. The longest serving of Mehmed II's grand viziers was Mahmud Pasha, who occupied the post for most of the period from about 1455 until his execution in 1474. Mahmud's origins are not certain. However, a Ragusan document of 1458 gives him the Slavonic family name of Angelovic, 17, suggesting that the story that he was a descendant of the Angelos lords of Thessaly is correct. It seems, too, that during his vizierate, members of his family continued to exercise power in Serbia since, in his account of the capture of the Serbian fortress of Smederevo in 1458, the chronicler Neshri claims that Mahmud's brother was in the fortress at the time of the siege, and that it was he who negotiated its surrender. It was, perhaps also because of Mahmud's Serbian connections that the Sultan put him in command of the expeditions that finally overran the Despotate of Serbia in 1458-9, and the Kingdom of Bosnia in 1463. Mahmud Pasha was not the only member of a Christian noble and Apas family to serve the Sultan at this period. The origin of his rival, Mehmed Pasha the Greek, was so well known as to become his sobriquet. It is very possible that he was from a noble Byzantine family. This was certainly the case with Has Murad Pasha, 18, who served not as a vizier on the Imperial Council, but as Governor-General of Rumelia until his death in 1473 in the war against Uzun Hasan. He was a Paleologos, a member of the Byzantine imperial family, as was Mizi Pasha 19 who, as vizier, commanded the unsuccessful siege of Rhodes in 1480. Bayezid II was to appoint him Grand Vizier on 3 occasions between 1485 and his death in 1501. Like Has Murad and Mizi Pasha, her Sekzade, the Duke's son, Ahmed Pasha, 25 times Grand Vizier between 1497 and 1516, was also the offspring of a ruling family. His father, Stephen Vuk Vik Cossack Va, the Duke of St. Sava, was ruler of a territory in southeastern Bosnia. It is from his title Herzog, Duke, that Herzegovina takes its name. His son seems to have converted to Islam and entered Mehmed II's court in 1473-4. The last vizier of such descent was Dukagin Zaid Ahmed, a member of the Albanian Dukagin family, descended from Duke John of Shkodër. 21. Like her Sekzade, he too seems to have converted and received an education at the court of Mehmed II. Bayezid II promoted him to become Governor-General of Anatolia. Under Bayezid's successor, Selim I, he became second and, finally, Grand Vizier until his execution in 1515.